Okay, so for part two of our first lecture, introducing us to realism, the first movement of modern American literature, we recapped a little bit on Romanticism. Let me go over a couple of things here that we brought up about the war and other things from our last video. The idealism of the Romantic movement is very apparent when you read Romantic works, but that idealism, the country is built for great things, we are almost divinely ordained to bring democracy and freedom and liberation to all people, things that a lot of us still kind of hold dear to our heart. We kind of want to think that about our country as being good at heart and dedicated to freedom and justice and all of those things and individual rights, fall short a lot. But we believe in those things anyway. These early idealistic views that you see in the Romantic movement kind of give way to a harsh reality because of the Civil War, but it leaves this legacy of belief in the improvement of our society. So whereas that early idealism is, shockingly displaced by the reality of the war and how horrible the war is, and trying to come up with a reason why would such a terrible thing happen to us. The one thing that does sort of stay on residually is the legacy of this belief that we can make society better, that the war was given to us as a challenge to overcome, to purify the country and to make ourselves a better people. Right? To renew ourselves, to remember, Romanticism embraces spiritual regeneration. Well, you see a sort of political and spiritual regeneration, right? We're purging ourselves of this horrible sin of slavery. We're going to rededicate ourselves, right, as Lincoln says, to the proposition that we're going to create a new country, okay, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. All of those kinds of things. We want to live up to that, right? We're going to make a better country, and it's going to be more unified. But again, the war gave people a chance to travel and see the vastness of the country. What kind of country are we? But it also, in doing that traveling, people began to see a lot of the problems with the nation. So people began to highlight the abuses of towards Native Americans, for example, poverty, lack of education, all of those things where you say, well, how can we be an equal country or dedicated to equality when not everybody has very good opportunities here? I mean, everybody's got a great opportunity to go where they want and do what they want. I mean, theoretically, but there are things that hold people back, and those could be poverty and ignorance and all kinds of things. The growth of the U.S. economy was tremendous after the Civil War and led to the concentration of wealth in the hands of very, 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 very wealthy people, but also this vast underclass of neglected people who are just living hand-to-mouth existence. And also this other problem of this huge influx of immigrants to fill all those jobs. The country's growing. We need workers. They're coming in from all over the world, which is fantastic, makes the country what it is today, which is a nice, multicultural, interesting place to live. But the big question is, okay, well, how do we keep a country cohesive? How do we keep a national identity if people are coming from all over the world? Aren't they going to want to be their own little enclaves all over the country? How do we forge a single national identity when we're such a diverse group of people? So these problems, these issues are all brought about because of the Civil War, making us sort of wake up to a new set of issues. If we're going to not be the same anymore, if we're going to dedicate ourselves, if freedom is a verb rather than a state of being, right? If we're going to be dedicated to making people freer, right? Every generation has its own task to do that. Then we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of things to deal with, a lot of things to grapple with, okay? So with realism, we get this new breed of writers, and these writers are very different because they believe that art should reflect life. The great new invention of the era was photography. Okay, you see some really, really early photography, tintypes and daguerreotypes and things like that early on before the war. But certainly photography comes into its own during the war. I mean, Matthew Brady and other people take pictures of the battlefield. You saw one of those pictures in the previous lecture's slides. That's gritty realism, folks. Dead bodies right in front of you. The carnage of the war comes home to people. They're able to see through the exhibit that Brady puts out called The Dead at Antietam exactly the carnage of the war. The writers of this period want their art and their literature, I should say, and certainly the artists of the period want their art to be like reality. They want it to be a reflection of reality. They want it to be descriptive, not prescriptive. Descriptive in that I'm just describing what I saw. I'm just taking a photo of life. I'm just giving you a sketch of what is out there. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not pushing a moral on you. The subject that I want to deal with is ordinary people living their ordinary lives and their day-to-day struggles. I want to democratize literature. And I want to take people who are middle-class people who may not run into lower-class people or working-class people or people from other parts of the country. And I want to show those people to those middle-class people in their suburban, nice, comfortable homes. So they're going to write about stuff like, believe it or not, prostitution and things, right? Which is pretty delicate for a Victorian, pretty delicate stuff for a 19th century. They're going to write about things like mental illness and things like that these readers haven't been used to. Realism is going to ask them to take a look at ordinary people in their lives as they are, not as they should be, not forcing some sort of moral on them, but giving them a sort of photograph or slice of life there. Now later, there's also another offshoot of that, which is called naturalism, which we'll only sort of vaguely touch on. It's a later offshoot of realism, and it presents us a world, usually through fiction, that's kind of deterministic. That is, that people are sort of the products of their environment, human beings as animals. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, that we are, this sort of literature is heavily influenced by sort of Darwinian natural selection of the period. The idea that human beings, when stripped down to their basics, behave like all other animals, self-preservation, those kinds of things, and that we're all products of our environment and our society. But we won't touch on naturalism so much now. We're really going to focus on realism, so keep that in mind. New breeder writers, different way of writing, different subject matter, different approach to things, okay? But before we get there, we've got two works, one by Whitman, one by Davis, that really are coming a little bit before realism. They're written at the beginning or during the war, but they already show the direction that literature is going to go. Some people would label these two works as being romantic. Other people would do what I do and say, you know what, they're proto-realistic, meaning they're sort of early realism, because they've got traits of both in them. Let's take a look first at Walt Whitman and his poem, The Wound Dresser. Now, if you're familiar at all with Walt Whitman, what you get with Whitman is an author that is very optimistic. Okay, he's really a romantic writer, wrote most of his great works prior to the Civil War, and embraces all those values that romantic writers would have embraced. Okay, very optimistic, is very stylistically revolutionary, and especially with Leaves of Grass, his most famous collection of poems. Whitman is strongly influenced by Emerson and other romantics, and is shares a lot of the characteristics with those guys. But he's writing here a war poem. He was a nurse during the war, and when he was there in the hospital for some time, Washington, D.C., he was profoundly moved by the sadness of that experience and those young men who were wounded, and many of them died. In the poem, as you see, he opens up, he portrays himself as this kind of old man speaking to young kids way in the distant future. Okay, recollecting what it was like to be that person in that hospital caring for those men. All right. By the way, most people don't realize this, but prior to the Civil War, most nurses were not female; they were male. And it's the Civil War which brought about really the rise of nursing as a female-dominated profession. Florence Nightingale, all of that kind of stuff. But nursing was considered a male profession. So he volunteered. Whitman was this weird guy because he always looked old. I mean, he's the kind of kid who I guess probably could grow a beard in kindergarten or something. He looked way older than he was. The picture you're looking at there, he's in his 40s. He looks like he's in his 60s, but he's actually in his 40s there. He was prematurely gray, and so he loved to grow his whiskers out and kind of come across as this old man figure even before he was old. But the poem starts out with this this, I got to go back in time. I got to search back in my memory. I'm going back. I'm opening up the doors to my memory, going back deeper, back farther, to recollect all of these things. And what's notable about the poem, I won't read it again to you, but what's notable about the poem is that it's very strikingly graphic for the time, because most war poetry that's romantic war poetry, whether it's about, the War of 1812 or the Revolutionary War or the Napoleonic Wars, is all about heroism and waving that sword and carrying the flag and, off men to the ramparts, and, we overcame, and exhausted and wounded we triumph, etc. It's the heroism and the patriotism of it. This poem really isn't that. It's this quiet homage to suffering, which is really different. And at the bottom of this slide, I say, go and contrast this to his earliest poem on the war, Beat, Beat Drums. It's a real rah-rah poem. It's a real, let's go off and fight the good fight and heroism for all of us, and come on, boys, let's do it. By the end of the war, after all the death and the suffering and the sadness and the tears and the carnage, he writes this poem, which, to be honest with you, anybody who's lived through war, it sure is different at the end of the thing than it is the beginning. There's a lot of marching bands and people proudly waving banners at the beginning, but at the end you just want it over with. And you get that real sense here. The hopelessness and despair of the poem is contrasted with the earlier patriotism and excitement, and he talks about that. Look, notice how graphic the descriptions of the deaths and the wounds are. This is not an optimistic conclusion. It's stoic resignation. Notice the final stanza here, if you will. We'll take a look at that one together, where he says, "Thus in silence, in dreams, projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals, the hurt," and now he's coming back to the present time because he's explored through his memory all these things. "The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips." Right? And by the way, don't be freaked out about the kiss thing, because men used to kiss, when they were very emotional. Okay? So, is it true that Whitman was gay? Yeah, but I don't think that this is kind of a gay thing, okay? It's about the fact that he just felt like at a certain point, I can't make it better. All I can do is just be with them and hold their hand and read to them and listen to them and just affirm their humanity, because dying is something that has with it great dignity if it's done right. And it's a really different kind of poem. This is not the kind of poem that a romantic poet would have written, because it's not what a romantic audience would have expected. They would have expected, heroism and we're going to overcome and, the last dying light, tell my mother I love her, blah, right? Whitman's like, no, death is not like that. Death is like that in storybooks, but that's how it's depicted in storybooks, but that's not how it is in real life. In real life, it is this slow flicker until the light goes out. And you just need to be quiet and patient and be with that person. It's so different from romantic poetry, and yet this is a romantic poet writing it. Now, Whitman never loses his optimism about human nature and about the country and how wonderful it's going to be, and our future is going to be so bright, and we're going to be a blessing to the entire world if we dedicate ourselves to our principles and overcome our prejudices and problems. We have great potential to do that. He's such an optimist. But even in this poem, he has that, look, it's not like what I thought it was going to be. Life is not like what we were told it would be when we were younger. There are some sad things that happen in life, and we can't make them go away. We can only try to endure them. Now, the big work that I really kind of want to get to is Davis's life in the iron mills. But before we dive into that a little bit, I want to kind of go over what I consider to be romantic elements versus realist elements. So I talked about the romantic movement, talked about realism coming at us. These two works are not what I would consider to be full-fledged realism works. They've got elements of romanticism in them. They've got elements of realism in them. Okay, what are those elements? Well, romantic elements, among all the others that I mentioned before, you'll notice that the language is very highly stylized in romantic works. What we would call dramatic or fancy language, right? You say, normal people don't talk like that. Did they really talk like that back then? No, they didn't. In Davis's life in the iron mills, you'll actually see an attempt at working class dialects, right? Which is really novel. It's very new, because even in the 1830s or 40s, Hawthorne would write working class people writing in very lengthy, fancy sentences with big vocabularies. And darn well no ditch digger actually spoke like that, right? But it didn't matter, because the audiences at that time were like, well, no, but we're reading because it's fiction. We're reading because we're pretending. But realist writers will say, no, let's have people talk like they really talk, okay? So in Rebecca Harding Davis's work, you're going to see sort of a mixture of both in a way, because she's already kind of rounding the curve towards realism, but she still uses some highly stylized language. There will be lots of emotional appeals, and there's an emotional appeal in this directly to the reader, which we'll get to in just a moment, right? There's usually a heroic struggle in romantic works, and you might have a little bit of that here too in some respects. There's symbolism. Well, you got a statue here, and boy, is it symbolic, okay? There's a love relationship in most romantic works. There's a love relationship here between Deborah and Hugh and all of those kinds of things. And then there's this really weird kind of buttoned-up, idealized Quaker woman at the end. Deb goes and does her time and then goes and lives with the Quakers. Really? Would that really happen? I don't know, maybe. But it's kind of an attempt at a happy ending, because, romantics just got to have that happy ending, okay? But it's a gritty, realistic work because the working class poor are her subject matter here. Nobody's writing about working class poor people who are illiterate and kind of live dirty, grimy lives. But she did. She's really kind of the first who did it. There's an attempt, like I said, at realistic dialogue. It's not very good, but she's doing her best. She wants working class people to sound like working class people, not like college professors or ministers. There is a threat of violence and class warfare here. That's what she's really concerned with. We cannot allow this tension, problem, inequity to keep boiling under the surface, because it's going to boil over. Got to be in the back of your mind things like the French Revolution, where, the underclasses who were oppressed and oppressed and oppressed, after a while, they broke out the guillotines and gave it to the upper classes. She is trying to warn us that there is a major social problem. She's using her fiction to depict a real social problem in its own terms, as gritty and realistically as she can, even though I don't think she's a full-fledged realism writer, because look at all the other romantic elements up above there. There's a focus on how money and class are dividing us in America. And this is something realist writers would be very concerned with. Really, this work being in 1861 is kind of surprisingly ahead of its time in that respect, not just in embracing some of these realism elements, which we're going to see in a lot of the realism fiction coming up in the next week or two. But she's already ahead of the curve, seeing that we have a real problem in the country. How do you fulfill the hope, the promise, the dream of democracy and equal rights and things when so much of the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small number of people? And although I think she kind of stretches it a bit, she just can't have Deb, die by throwing herself off of the cliff or something like that. She has to go have her live with the Quakers. It's still not a very happy ending, because, of course, Hugh commits suicide. It's a really bleak kind of thing. It's not really pleasant at all. So be aware that, especially in this work, just like in Whitman's, the reason I'm asking you to read it is because these are not works that are in the realist movement. They're really kind of straddling the fence between romanticism and realism, because I want you to see the romantic elements that are in them and the realism elements. So let's dive on in. Oops, let me go back here. We'll get to that one in just a moment. Pardon me here while I work my way through. Don't want to start over here. Want to cover a little bit more on Davis's work and talk about it. Let's take a look at one of the lines that I think is really important. First of all, you got your narrator here, right? Your narrator. Who is this narrator? Who is she? I'm assuming it's a she. I think it's a she. Maybe it's a he. But this person is in a house and wants to tell us something about the people who lived in that house and wants to share a story with us. And it's a very moving kind of direct, blunt style. It's a very unusual style. It's not at all the kind of style that, say, a Hawthorne or a Poe would use. But there's one line that's super important where she says, "Stop a moment. I'm going to be honest. This is what I want you to do. I want you to hide your disgust, take no heed to your clean clothes, and come right down with me, here into the thickest of the fog and mud and foul effluvia. I want you to hear this story. There is a secret down here in this nightmare fog that has lain dumb for centuries. I want to make it a real thing to you. That's so direct and blunt and kind of shocking to say, listen to me. Listen to me. I got something to tell you. You need to hear this. Sit down. Right? There's a sense of urgency and sort of this ominous voice and everything. So it's a really interesting thing that she's providing here. And I think this is a really remarkable work because it blends these features of romantic and realist fiction as we're talking about. But it's such an early example of this. You have to try to forgive the rustic nature of the narrative. She's not the most polished writer, okay? I'm going to give you that. But she really is visionary in this respect, highlighting the plight of the lower classes, as I said, and this kind of the work was written, as I said, in 1861. But at the same time, it's dealing with these class struggles and oppression, etc. So we have Hugh Wolfe, who works in the iron mills, and he works really hard. He's Welsh immigrant family, etc. Doesn't really know how to read and write. Doesn't really have any education. He frequently listens to things and doesn't really understand certain conversations. Like, what are they talking about? I can't even figure out what they're talking about. And when Mitchell, Kirby, and Dr. May come visit the foundry, and they're walking through, they stop dead in their tracks looking at this statue that Hugh has created. The statue is of a woman with, we don't know exactly what, but a very, very engrossing and riveting and hypnotic expression on her face of desperation, of questioning, of something. Big, strong, muscular arms for a woman with an outreached hand. And they're stunned by it and want to know who made this and what is it and what are you trying to say through this? And the only response from Hugh is, she be hungry for something in life. That's what it is. That's what he says. They're like struggling. Well, what does this statue mean? And clearly they sort of debate among themselves what to make of this. Kirby believes, well, no, he shouldn't be given an opportunity to develop these talents. He can do that on his own. If he wants to stop working in the mill, he can stop working in the mill and go become an artist on his own, right? Nobody needs a leg up. This is your leg up. Make yourself what you are. Mitchell says, well, no, I think he needs help. Well, I don't have any money to help him. I can't really do anything for you. And someone should really take him under their wing and allow him to develop his talents. And Dr. May basically stops and says, you're fantastic. You have great talent. You really should do this for a living. But May isn't willing to do it because May doesn't have any money either to help him, or at least he says so anyway. But the fact that he has talent, but we don't really see him being in a position of developing that talent is the sort of the crux of the story. Now, the world of Hugh and Deborah obviously is just this living hell, right? Because notice how many fire and devil references there are, right? That's pretty obvious. It's kind of over the top. They live this ugly, dirty existence with no hope of escape. People are born into this class of workers. They live their lives in exhaustion and ignorance, and then they die. That's it, right? That is their life, right? There's no sense of Maslow's hierarchy of self-fulfillment here. No, this is about just eating and living, and that's it. There's no beauty, no joy, no purpose to their lives. They're just a big tool in the factory. And in fact, they're spoken of that way by Kirby as kind of being tools, not even human beings. Essentially it's a really dehumanizing environment that would have, I think, spoken to the Romantics. I think that's where the revolutionary aspect of this is. Davis I think she grew up as a Romantic writer. And so the thing that she's trying to appeal to among fellow Romantics is, these people have no opportunity to develop spiritually, culturally, or anything. They're just basically paid slaves is all they are, and their lives will never amount to anything. And even when somebody comes along like Hugh, who has tremendous talent, that'll all go to waste because he's never going to be able to develop it. And by the way, you have to ask yourself whether it was a good idea for Dr. May to even tell Hugh, gosh, son, you're really talented. You should do this. Because it's that point where Hugh says, yeah, I should do it. I love doing it. I'm good at it. And what am I doing here? Get me out of here. But he can't. You see? He can't. And it's that moment, that flicker, where he says, yeah, that isn't fair. Why can't I do what I want to do? Why can't I be what I want to be? Why can't my life be something other than just, a piece of machinery? That awareness is kind of a dangerous thing. That the secret that she's talking about? Is that the secret that she wants to tell us? That one day, someday, this is going to explode? That this is a problem and we're not seeing it because you don't see it, middle class reader. You only see the products of the iron mill. You don't see the process and the people that are involved in it. Kind of like with slavery. People would gladly wear cotton outfits and have cotton things and whatnot, not ever asking anything about where that cotton came from. And you and I both know where it came from. And you and I both know the injustice and the evil that brought it about the way it was. But it's really easy to kind of turn our eye the other way and do this thing. By the way, if you think all this is in the past, you might want to ask who made your Apple iPhone or your Nike sneakers and what kind of conditions they were in over in China. Anyway, just a little editorializing. Sorry about that. Food for thought. I wonder what our grandchildren are going to think of how we turned a blind eye to how other people around the world in other countries, because we didn't see them, were oppressed for our convenience. But that's another story. What is the secret that she's talking about here? That there's something in it. At a certain point, she says, their lives ask it, their deaths ask it, there is no reply. So you have to figure out what you think the secret is that she's trying to convey, but it has something to do with that statue, and it has something to do with that look, and it has something to do with Hugh's conundrum of never being able to live up to what he seems to have been put on the planet to do. And it's sad, and it's tragic, and it's a huge waste. So let's contrast the viewpoints of Kirby, Dr. May, and Mitchell. What you're seeing is this kind of cross-section with those guys of different reactions from the middle and the upper classes to the strength, the potential, the inherent creativity of somebody like Hugh Wolf, a common, ignorant, I don't mean that negatively, laborer, right? Different people are going to perceive a guy like that different ways. Some are going to say, oh, we need to save him, we need to help him. Some people are going to say, hey, look, that's c'est la vie. If he wants to help himself, let him help himself. It's not my job to help this guy realize artistic, happiness. And then another person's like, well, I'd like to help, but I can't, I've got to think about me, So it's this cross section of different attitudes. So why is his talent so potentially threatening? It's the power of art to make people think. And the system they're living in is not a system where you really want people on the lower end of the lower rungs of the ladder to do an awful lot of thinking, right? Because once they start doing that, they end up like Hugh. They become very dissatisfied. Now, we know what happens. What happens is they begin to realize all of these things. And by the way, another thing that we can backtrack on a little bit. What does it say about democracy? That people, a democracy, I should say, that people are kept economically oppressed as these people are. I mean, at one point, Kirby comments on how his father brought 700 votes to the polls for his candidate last November, right? You voted for the boss's favorite candidate, or you lost your job and starved, is what he's saying. If I want the people in my factory to vote a certain way because I want my candidate to win, that's what well, right there is just the most horribly undemocratic thing you can imagine. So what Davis is depicting is a world here where people who are oppressed don't fully realize their oppression, but they're very oppressed. That it's a world where the people are living lives that are not consistent with the nation's values and norms and political structure. And one day they will be. One day they will be. And so you better be careful, and you better start looking at these people, and you better start paying attention to them, because you're going to be in for it if you don't. At one point, the statue itself says, what shall we do to be saved? It kind of comes across that way. She says it kind of has that look of what do we need to do to be saved? But it's emblematic of the entire class, of the oppressed working classes. I do have to ask this seriously. Is Dr. May ethically wrong for even encouraging Hugh to rise in a world where we know that's never going to happen? I mean, is that wrong to do? Or, I mean, do you really want to tell somebody that you could have had a different future, but you're never going to have it? May is clearly wrong that in that country, in that day and age, in that society, the idea that a man may make of himself anything he chooses is just a flat out lie. It's just not true, right? But what Deb does is she discovers what she thinks is the key. And she thinks the key is money. And of course she steals the wallet, and they both get caught, and they're in trouble, and they go to jail and all this kind of stuff. You read the whole thing yourself. But she seems to think the difference between, and Hugh thinks so too. Hugh has to go through, do I want to do this? This is wrong. I shouldn't keep this. Should I keep this? Should I not keep this? He goes through a kind of a spiritual crisis. Well, God made money for everybody. He didn't just make it for some people. Why is it fair that they get more than I do? I'm doing all this work. They're not. Why is there this huge divide between the two of us? And it seems like, he works it out. He makes a decision that ultimately leads to his imprisonment, obviously. But I submit to you that the reason that they both end up where they end up isn't just the theft, yes, but it's also the misconception that the difference between Hugh and Kirby is merely money. It's not merely money. It isn't. It's power. One has control over his life, the other one doesn't. Now you might say, well, money creates that. Well, yes and no, because they end up getting the money, but because they don't have any knowledge, or because they're not able to cash the check properly, I guess, I don't know, without getting caught, because they don't have the intelligence. And I don't mean that. I mean that by, in terms of education, the wherewithal to do all this. It's like the person who really is just terribly uneducated and has lived in poverty all his or her life, and then they hit the lottery, and you're not surprised to find out that a year later it's all gone, right? Because it's not the money. It's the education, the ability to utilize money as a resource that makes the difference. You know, is it true that with money, Hugh could have been a great artist? Yes and no. Only if he had been able to manage the money properly, only if he had been able to use money as a resource for productive good. Kirby and his family are very good at that. It's just that they're not very good with spreading those opportunities towards other people, right? They don't really seem to care about other people and their opportunities. They don't think it does any good. They look at somebody like Hugh and say, oh, he's a laborer. He'll always be a laborer. You're wasting your money on somebody like that. And then the fact that Deb steals and Hugh goes along with it just reinforces the opinion of upper class people that working class people can't be trusted. They're just shiftless and they're dishonest, and they're just a lower form of life, which is very sad. And of course, at the end, he takes his own life, and and Deb does not. She serves out her prison term. It's a kind of a quasi-happy ending. It's really kind of a quasi-sad ending, to be honest with you, because Hugh dies, and he's gone, his talent's gone, the world will never benefit, except for the one statue that is still kept in that home behind a curtain that the narrator wants us to see. So, bear in mind, think about it. What are the romantic elements in these two pieces? What are the realist elements in these two pieces? Hope you agree with me that they're kind of a foreshadowing of the kind of works we're about to read here in the next week. So let me familiarize you with the quiz and discussion. I kind of gave you a peek accidentally towards this earlier on, didn't I? Okay. So we have 3 quiz questions. You just simply email me at alfredlitton@yahoo.com. Please only submit your quiz answers to that email address, not my TWM email address. Please don't use the email with Canvas. It just gets lost in everything. Just send me the answers. You don't need to send the questions. Just send me the answers. The answers don't have to be terribly lengthy. The answers are just enough to let me know that you read the material. Okay, so number 1, what city was Walt Whitman a hospital nurse in? What was the city he was in? Number 2, what's the name of the substance Hugh Wolf carves his statue out of? And number 3, from whom does Deb steal the money? Send that to me no later than Thursday at midnight, I think is what I said. And then also, I'm going to create 2 discussion threads for our class. You don't have to respond to other people's. These will be simply thought questions, and I'll ask you to give me your thoughts or ideas in about 3-4 sentences, 5 sentences maybe. Don't write an essay. I'm not looking for that, but don't write a quickie little response either. Give me a few sentences. It may ask you to pull an example as well. Both of those threads, please respond to those threads no later than Thursday at midnight as well. Okay? Most of our other lectures won't be this long, but I needed to get us started in the right direction and cover a lot of ground on this one. If you have some questions, email me. I will be around and be responsive. Thanks.